Hello everyone, welcome to part 1 of chapter 17 on the endocrine system. Now, what I did is I went ahead and I modified some of the PowerPoints that have been posted previously on D2L. And what you're going to notice is that I've added some blue highlights and some more examples and some explanations. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to kind of peruse through the video at your own pace, stop and make notes as you go along. And if you come across any areas where you have some questions, comments, or you just have some concerns, please go ahead and log on to D2L and you'll see the specific discussing session for chapter 17. I would love for you to post all your comments and concerns and questions there so that everybody in class can see my reply. And if you're not comfortable doing so, I'm always available per email. So having said that, let's go ahead and let's get started by looking at our endocrine system. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that this system is extremely diverse. And what we're going to see is as we go and we look at our hormones, we're going to notice that you can have an organ that produces and distributes the hormones. You can also have a gland, but you can also have batches of tissues as well as cells that can go ahead and secrete these chemical messengers. So there's a lot of diversity, and by no means will we be able to cover every single hormone the body produces, but you'll definitely get a nice comprehensive view, and we'll take a look at the majority and the most common hormones. So the way the lecture is set up is after our little intro, we're going to start on top of the body and work our way down. We're going to take a look at our hypothalamus, our pituitary gland, and our pineal gland, and then we're going to come on down and take a look at what the thyroid and the thymus are contributing. And then finally, as we move down, we're going to encounter the pancreas, the adrenal gland, and then our gonads, our reproductive organs, the testes and the ovaries. And all along the way, as we're chit-chatting, keep in mind that on your end, you want to know what is the hormone, where is it produced, and what is its mechanism of action. All right, so let's do a quick comparison. What is the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland? And you're going to see these terms quite a bit in your anatomy and physiology course. So you definitely want to know exactly what they're about and how they have some commonality, but also what their differences are. So both of these glands will be able to give you a secretion, and both of these glands are important for our homeostasis because it allows our body to obviously communicate not only internally, but also externally. But their method and their action of their secretion will be quite different. So as you look at your PowerPoint, what you're going to notice is you have two columns. You have your exocrine glands on the left and your endocrine glands on the right. And if we look at our exocrine glands, the first thing that's going to pop up is the fact that when it has a secretion, it will travel through ducts. So they'll use a channel method to transport its secretion, and oftentimes this secretion will go ahead and be secreted into an opening or an external surface. So I wrote down that oftentimes your end goal is to be exposed to the outside or maybe a hollow organ space if you're looking at an exocrine gland. In addition, we see that the effects will be extracellular, meaning outside of the cell's internal mechanism. So I'll give you a few examples. Probably the best one is sweat. Sweat will be produced by your sweat glands. It will travel through the follicles and it will exit through the pores. And as it exits through the pores, it is exposed to the external surface, aka your skin, where it goes ahead and has a cooling mechanism. We can see the same thing with the digestive enzymes produced by the pancreas. The pancreas will produce these enzymes. It will travel through the pancreatic duct, and it will then be deposited into the opening of the duodenum, which is the top part of your small intestines. How about your ovulating egg and sperm transport? Those are also examples of exocrine gland. The egg is produced by the ovaries. It will then travel through the fallopian tube. There's your duct, and it will then go ahead and be placed in the uterus. There's your opening. Obviously, the egg can also be secreted outside of the body, which will also count as an external excretion. Your sperm also follows a very similar pathway. It's produced in the testes and will then travel through the vas deferens, that little duct that carries it from the testes all the way through the penis. And as it's excreted externally, it's exposed to an opening. On the other hand, if you look at an endocrine gland, then what you're going to be seeing is that you have these secretions called chemical messengers. And the chemical messengers are more commonly known as hormones. And what will make these secretions unique is that they will not travel in a duct. Instead, they will always travel in a bloodstream. So you always have a mention of a capillary bed, or you'll see what they call a portal system, where they have the arteries and vein depicted as their transport mechanism. A hormone becomes active when it finds its target cell, and when it finds its target cell, it will cause internal metabolics of the cells to alter. So things like activating transcription, altering the DNA expression, producing different enzymes. Either way, we see that you always have an intracellular effect. So the actual workings of the inside of the cell, its actual metabolism will start to be changing because of the hormone secretion. So for instance, if you think about your thyroid hormone, if you think about insulin, if you think about testosterone and estrogen, all of these are examples of hormones because they travel through the blood system, and all of them, when they make contact with their target cell, will cause this individual cell to behave and react differently, making it an endocrine gland. Now, in the little red box, I stated a question. What exactly is a mixed gland? Well, a mixed gland has the ability to have both an exocrine as well as an endocrine secretion. And as we start discussing the chapter, we're going to see several mixed glands, but for now, I want to show you the most common, and those are going to be found in our reproductive system. For instance, ovaries. Ovaries can go ahead and produce an egg, but on the other hand, they can also go ahead and produce and release estrogen. That makes it a mixed gland. Same thing for the testes. It's able to produce sperm, which we know is an exocrine secretion, but it's also able to produce testosterone, which is an endocrine secretion. How about the pancreas? We know the pancreas because it gives us our insulin, but beforehand I also talked about the fact that it produces digestive enzymes. So here's another example of a mixed gland. Another way that the body can communicate both internally and externally is through the use of the nervous system. So now we're looking at things like our brain and our spinal cord. However, the way that the nervous system and the endocrine system go about communicating is quite differently. So over here you have a slide which will compare the two systems based on their speed, their persistence of response, their adaptation, and the area of effect. Now, when it comes to the nervous system, we see that it can react very quickly and it can also stop quickly. And part of that entails knowing that the nervous system is composed of our neurons. Our neurons have our axons, which often tend to be myelinated, and that will speed up the action potential as it travels down over to its target. However, as soon as the action potential stops, so does the actual signal. The endocrine system, on the other hand, tends to have a slower response. Part of that is because not all hormones are produced in bulk, so sometimes it will take a little bit of a delay for us to actually make these hormones, and then the hormones still have to travel into the bloodstream to get to their actual target cells. The good news is, though, is that the response tends to be longer in an endocrine system because it will have a continuous interaction between the hormones and the target cells. In adaptation, what we see is that the nervous system will tend to adapt very quickly, which means that the response starts to decline. If you would like to have it respond in an increasing manner or in a continuous manner, what needs to be done is to increase the stimulus. The endocrine system, on the other hand, even though it will take a little bit slower to get started, the response will continue to persist as long as the hormone has a target cell to react with. And last but not least is the area of effect. Nervous system tends to have very targeted and specific responses. And the best example of that is when we discussed the skeletal muscle and their neuromuscular junction. It can only interact with one organ at a time. The endocrine system tends to have a much more widespread effect. And in fact, we see that you can have various target cells for the same hormone found all over in the body. A good example would that be, for instance, of epinephrine. If epinephrine is secreted, it can go ahead and find target cells in the lungs and the bronchioles. All right, so let's take a look at this illustration right here, comparing the nervous system and the endocrine system. In the top box, we see the neurons communicating with their target cells through the nerve impulses. And at the bottom, as we can see, we have our endocrine system that is releasing its chemical messenger, the little green dots, into the bloodstream as it travels over to the target cells. All right, so a really nice way to kind of get started with the endocrine system and hormone production and secretion is to take a look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Both are found within the brain. So on this PowerPoint, you can go ahead and take a look at the illustration that is on the right-hand side, and you'll see that the hypothalamus is located by the floor of the brain near the third ventricle. It is like a fluted structure, and it's been studied extensively, and we know it has a wide variety of functions, including being able to regulate our internal body temperature. It does help us with our timing of puberty. It helps us with our sex drive, with childbirth, and we also see that it plays a role in things like electrolyte and water balance. Dangling off the hypothalamus will be the pituitary gland, and the small gland will actually be housed in the sella turcica. Now, if that term sounds familiar to you, it is because when you guys studied your skeletal system, you learned about the sphenoid bone in the cranium. That was that bat-shaped bone. Well, the pituitary gland sits perfectly in that little dip of the sphenoid bone, which is called the sella turcica. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are physically connected through what we call the infundibulum, which is a little stalk, a little connection point. And what's really important to realize is that the hypothalamus will have full control over the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. That's right, the pituitary gland is composed of two different structures. It has the adenohyphysis, which is the anterior pituitary, and it has the neurohyphysis, which is the posterior pituitary. These two entities sit so close together that they look like one gland together, but they are completely different when it comes from its embryonic origin, as well as when it comes to the particular hormones that they will be producing and secreting. So let's take a look at where exactly the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland come from. And in order to do that, we have to go and take a look at embryonic development. So here in this illustration, we see our progress at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 16 weeks. And if we start on the top picture, you're going to notice that I've highlighted a region called the Neurohypophysis bud. This is going to be the starting point of the posterior pituitary gland. And what this illustration is trying to show you is that around 4 weeks, there is an extension of nervous tissue, very similar to the tissue that makes up the hypothalamus, that will go ahead and lengthen, elongate, and will give rise to our posterior pituitary gland. So from an embryonic origin, your posterior pituitary gland is composed of nothing but neurons and glial cells, just like your hypothalamus. Your anterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, we see its development around 8 weeks. Well, we actually see its transition around 8 weeks. If you come on down to the picture, find your 8 weeks illustration on the bottom left, you're going to see that they've indicated for you the pharynx region, which is the back of the throat. And we see that around 8 weeks, there'll be a little hypophyseal pouch that will pinch off the pharynx and will migrate over to the infundibulum and attach itself over to the stalk, lying ever so closely to the posterior pituitary gland. Now, that little offbud of the pharynx is what will give rise to our anterior pituitary gland, a completely different histology than the posterior pituitary gland with its nervous tissue. So around 16 weeks, we see that the pituitary gland has been fully formed, and it will go ahead and dangle from the infibulum, and the hypothalamus will start taking full control over its secretion. But keep in mind that they actually don't physically touch, they just lie very close together. Now, for the anterior pituitary gland, besides knowing that it's from the pharynx location from an embryonic standpoint, you also need to be able to know how exactly your hypothalamus will be communicating with it. And first off, the anterior pituitary gland is the larger of the two. It makes up about 3/4 of the entire pituitary gland. And we see that if the hypothalamus wants to control it, it's going to have to utilize what we call the hypothalamo-portal system. This is a blood system composed of lots and lots of capillaries. So what we'll see is that the hypothalamus will release hormones. Those hormones will travel through the portal system, through the blood system, and will have full control over the hormones that the anterior pituitary gland will release and will inhibit. So here on this illustration, if we start looking on the right-hand side, we see our hypothalamus utilizing the portal venules and the capillaries, indicated by those blue lines, to release its hormones and travel it over to the anterior pituitary gland so it can go ahead and stimulate or release its particular hormones. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look on the left-hand side, and we're going to notice that we have a purple box indicating our hypothalamus hormones. These are 6 hormones that the hypothalamus produces that will exclusively control the anterior pituitary gland. Now, here's a little bit of good news. You do not have to memorize these hormones. You simply have to know that there are 6 hormones coming from the hypothalamus, traveling through a portal system that have control over the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, in response, will produce and release 6 hormones. These you will have to know, and these are indicated in the pink box. In a little bit, we'll go over the function of the follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. So don't memorize the purple box, but do memorize and know the pink box. Switching over to the posterior pituitary gland, remember from an embryonic origin, it is the same nervous tissue as you would find in the hypothalamus. So what we see happening is that if the hypothalamus wants to communicate with the posterior pituitary gland, it does not need to use a portal system. Instead, it will utilize what we call the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And the terminology of the tract indicates that we'll be using the axon from the neurons as they extend from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary gland. So once again, no bloodstream, no capillaries, no portal system is required for the hypothalamus to communicate with the posterior pituitary gland. Another interesting fact is that your hypothalamus will produce 2 hormones that will be brought over to the posterior pituitary gland. They will be stored there, and the posterior pituitary gland will release these hormones. That's right, the posterior pituitary gland actually does not produce any of its own hormones. It simply stores and releases the hormones that come from the hypothalamus. A quick anatomical notation: the posterior pituitary gland is significantly smaller than the anterior pituitary gland. It only makes up about 25% of the entire pituitary gland structure. All right, so here on this illustration, we can see our hypothalamus with now a focus on our posterior pituitary gland, and we see that there's no mention of venules and portal systems. Instead, we see the extension of the neurons as they are allowing the nervous tissue from the hypothalamus to directly correspond with the nervous tissue in the posterior pituitary gland. Notice also by the blue and the green arrow, those are the two hormones that are being produced by your hypothalamus and stored in your posterior pituitary gland. They are the oxytocin and the antidiuretic ADH hormone. All right, so just to kind of quickly recap on the hypothalamus, it produces 8 hormones altogether. 6 of them will focus on the anterior pituitary gland. Those are the ones located in the purple box on slide number 10. You will not need to memorize those. And then the other 2 are going to be released to the tract system into the posterior pituitary gland. Those are your oxytocin and your antidiuretic hormone, and those will be stored and released by the posterior pituitary gland. I cannot emphasize enough that the posterior pituitary gland does not synthesize or produce any of its own hormones. It simply stores and releases the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Now, for those of us taking lab, we're also going to be exposed to some of the histology sections of the endocrine chapter. So let's take a look at the anterior versus the posterior pituitary gland from a histology aspect. And one thing you should notice right away is that there are a lot more cells in the anterior than there are in the posterior. And this will obviously correspond with the fact that the anterior pituitary gland produces and stores its own hormones. So it will have different cells to do that function. And that is why if you look closely at your slide, you're going to notice the acetophils, the basophils, and the chromophobe cells being individually labeled. On the other hand, the posterior pituitary gland is simply a storage mechanism. It doesn't have to secrete any of its own, it doesn't have to synthesize any of its own hormones. So what you're going to notice is lots of fibers, lots of glial cells, a little bit of neurons will make an appearance, and that's because it doesn't have to do any synthesizing. It's simply storing its oxytocin and its antidiuretic hormone. Alrighty, so let's go back to our anterior pituitary gland, and we know that there are 6 hormones that we need to know, and we need to be able to describe their function. So let's go down the list and let's get familiar with them. So first things first, we're going to take a look at the fact that some of these hormones are what we call tropin hormone. Now, what exactly is a tropin hormone? Well, a tropin hormone is a hormone that when released will cause the release of a secondary hormone. So its main purpose is simply to go ahead and cause a cascading reaction where that hormone will be released, will find its target cells, and the target cells will go ahead and secrete a secondary hormone. Probably the easiest one to explain is if we take a look at the one number 3. We have a hormone called the thyroid stimulating hormone. When that hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland, it will travel over to the thyroid and it will cause the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. So to make it easier to identify a tropin hormone, you're often going to notice that they'll utilize stimulating within its name. So for instance, you have the follicle stimulating hormone, you have your thyroid stimulating hormone. We also have some that don't include stimulating, so I'll definitely be showing you which ones are tropin and which one are not. So to answer the second question, how many tropin hormones does the anterior pituitary produce? The answer is 4. It's going to produce 4 hormones that are tropin, and of those 4, 2 of them are going to be specifically targeting the gonads, so they're going to be further subdivided as gonadotropin hormones. So if you take a look at the top section of your slide, you're going to see that it says there are 2 gonadotropin hormones that are being produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Because they're tropins, they're going to cause the release of other hormones, and because they target the gonads, they can be subclassified as gonadotropin. They will be the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone will travel over to the ovaries or the testes, and it will cause the production of sex hormones, which will ultimately cause the production and release of the follicles, the egg and the sperm cells. The luteinizing hormone will also be released by the anterior pituitary gland. It will also travel over to the gonads, ovaries, and testes, and it will cause the release of the main sex hormones, the estrogen and the testosterone. In addition, you also have the third tropin hormone, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone, which, as I mentioned to you before, will travel over to the thyroid to cause the release of the thyroid hormone. The fourth and final tropin hormone is going to be the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This hormone will travel over to the adrenal gland, which sits directly on top of the kidneys, and it will interact with the adrenal cortex. Very important to highlight that. It will only interact with the adrenal cortex, and it will cause the release of various glucocorticoids, which we will discuss in great detail in our next lecture. These hormones will play a role in our fight or flight response, so they'll activate our sympathetic nervous system. So to overview, the tropin hormones of the anterior pituitary gland are your follicle-stimulating hormone, your luteinizing hormone, your thyroid-stimulating hormone, and your adrenocorticotropic hormone. Also notice how a lot of hormones have abbreviations. For our exam, I will be writing out the entire name as well as including the abbreviation. Now, the two remaining hormones for the anterior pituitary gland are not tropin. They are going to be prolactin and growth hormone. They are not tropin because their response to the target cell will cause an immediate metabolic or actual product to be produced. So in the case of prolactin, we see this hormone being secreted after birth. This will stimulate the modified sweat glands, which have turned into mammary glands, to go ahead and synthesize milk. This is one of the reasons why when a woman becomes pregnant, she's going to notice that her breasts start to increase, and that's because prolactin will start being produced, and it will actually sit in the mammary glands, waiting for signal to be released once the baby is born. The last hormone of your anterior pituitary gland is going to be growth hormone. Growth hormone has so many different effects on the body, but to keep everything nice and simple, I went ahead and I said for growth hormone, we see that it spikes during puberty, which allows us to increase our height and muscle content dramatically. It also allows us to develop our reproductive organs, and what we see happening is that the level of growth hormone will start tapering down as we go into adulthood, because it will then be used for maintenance of our bone and muscle composition. All right, as we encounter our final slide for this presentation, this one shows us what we call axis. It shows us the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, as well as the target organs that it's trying to reach. And when you look at this, it just highlights the fact that the hypothalamus has full control over the hormones that are being produced and released in the anterior pituitary gland. And what we can also see are the 6 hormones from the anterior pituitary gland: prolactin and growth hormone, and then the tropin hormones, which are your thyroid stimulating hormone, your adrenocorticotropic hormone, your luteinizing hormone, and your follicle stimulating hormone. Now, one thing that I want to point out, and actually someone did mention this in class, is if you take a look at your hypothalamus and you remind yourself that it produces 6 hormones that have full control over what's happening with hormone production and release in the anterior pituitary glands, then you might also realize that those 6 hormones produced by the hypothalamus are all considered tropin hormones, because their secretion will cause the anterior pituitary gland to release a secondary hormone. Some food for thought. All right, guys, this is the end of part 1. Remember that you can go ahead and post all your comments and questions into our discussion sections on D2L, and I'm always available through email. So I'll hopefully see you for part 2 soon.